Now, let's discuss that further with Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Mr. Gosling, welcome to the program. Well, Zelensky has indicated that territorial issues will be addressed later in a trilateral meeting with President Putin and Washington. Does it suggest that Ukraine will be pressured into concessions of those territories?
Definitely. What you could say is Zelensky's done a U-turn. Up until today, he's been saying there will never be any concessions, no Ukrainian land will be given away. And we have to remember that it was actually in the 1950s and 1960s that Ukraine borders were drawn by these Soviet communist leaders. And so that was done in quite an arbitrary way, cutting right through the Russian-speaking area. What's happened now is that due to the Maidan coup in 2014 and the draconian measures taken by the new West-backed regime in Kiev, that there has been a complete change in the shape of the country, because you can't have a far-right, fascistic, Nazified leadership imposing Ukrainian language, etc., onto the Russian people who are living in the Donbass. But he's completely done a U-turn, and it's hardly surprising. Everybody with intelligence, which does not include the Western media, looking at this knows that in a war, often territory is conceded in ceasefire terms. So, for example, there were various ceasefires in Palestine. And Resolution 242 in 1967 drew the borders, but the Israelis refused to return to them. So every time the West says we cannot have any conceding territory, I scream, Israel, maybe you should never concede territory in Palestine. And so they're total hypocrites, and they've been forced into this position because the Ukrainian army is collapsing. After 2.5 years and 1 million dead soldiers, the Ukrainians cannot find anyone else prepared to fight. They have to put a gun to somebody's head to go and fight Russia, because, of course, it's a totally pointless exercise now. And so they've been forced to come to some sort of arrangement to have a truce, and they will have to change the borders. Of course they will.
Exactly. Well, Donald Trump has vowed that Washington will guarantee Ukraine's security even without a ceasefire. How realistic do you see such a promise?
Well, look, what they're now talking about, I see, is that European countries will come into Ukraine to guarantee that Russia doesn't break the ceasefire. Well, actually having troops in Ukraine does not guarantee anything. But what it does do is it starts to look a bit like NATO. European countries coordinated by the United States having troops in Ukraine. If that happens, which it looks like they're now discussing, that looks very much like NATO, except it hasn't got the NATO name. This is one thing, I think, which is a red line, which the Russians cannot allow them to cross. They don't want NATO troops, because what they've seen over the decades, ever since 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, is NATO pushing closer and closer and closer to Russia. And they don't want to have NATO soldiers and troops. What NATO does is it starts off with a few troops, then it brings in an airbase. Like, for example, it's building a massive new airbase in Romania on the Black Sea coast right now for 10,000 or so NATO troops. And they're moving everything closer and closer to surround the Russians. The Russians, of course, don't want this. So it will be interesting to see if the Russians actually agree to having what looks like NATO without the NATO name on it moving into Ukraine as some sort of guarantee. The only guarantee you really need, I think, is not that the Russians might break a ceasefire or a truce, is that the Ukrainians might do what they did back since 2014 and start lobbing shells across the border into the Donbass, which is what killed 15,000 people in the Donbass region of Ukraine between 2014 and 2022, in 8 years. They were the ones who were constantly violating the Minsk Treaty, the Minsk agreements that had been drawn up after the coup. And so there, it's the Russians, I think, are the ones who really need the security. What we're getting is a lot of reversal. So the Western NATO blaming the other side for their own errors. And it's similar, in fact, to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. The Israelis are always blaming Palestinians and Iran for the things that they do. Terrorism, for example, pager attacks. Remember them?
Yep. Mr. Gosling, we also saw Emmanuel Macron pushing for a four-way summit that includes Putin, Zelensky, Donald Trump, and European leaders. Does this reveal a lack of trust in Washington's role as the sole mediator, or is it more about Europe trying to fit itself in a post-war order?
Well, I'm not sure these European leaders can really push for anything, because the Russians know exactly what's going on and they will only talk to the people who are serious about peace. Zelensky certainly is. He's somebody that once an agreement is forged has to be sort of dragged into the room to sign a piece of paper. He's not a big decision maker. He's an entertainer. He's an actor who's been put into a role of president, which has, by the way, expired last year. His constitutional role as president is no longer. And so really he's a pawn in the game that the Western countries use. So the Russians will only speak to the people who are serious about peace. And at the moment, that just looks like Trump and the United States. Now, the Americans, of course, are also looking for money. They're looking to have mineral rights and all that sort of thing out of Ukraine. And so I guess that's what Trump's main effort here is yes, there's a lot of talk about stopping the killing, ending, increase of over 1 million people now dead on both sides in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and many actually NATO mercenaries have been killed as well by the Russians who've been sneaking in there. So that, I think, is going to be the end game. Is some sort of deal will be done between Putin and most likely the United States. But I don't think the European leaders are really in a position to push for anything, because they are the ones driving this war in the first place, not Zelensky and not ordinary Ukrainians at all.
Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Thank you for your time tonight.